The call came in the way they always did, wrapped in static and rumor, half a report and half a ghost story. Somewhere in the rural South, in a county whose name barely appeared on federal maps, something had begun moving through the livestock, then through the farmers, then through the small towns that lined the highways like beads on a forgotten string. Leon S. Kennedy listened to the briefing the way a surgeon listens to a symptom list he has heard 100 times before. Another outbreak. Another quiet corner of America about to become a closed file. He checked his sidearm, zipped his jacket, and told himself this would be over by the end of the week. He expected the usual signs. Corporate black vans in the tree line. Hazard suits abandoned in ditches. Something mutated crawling out of a basement laboratory that no one had bothered to shut down properly. He expected fast things, clever things, things that screamed when they ran at you. That was the world he knew. A world of engineered monsters and buried contracts, where every nightmare had a logo stamped somewhere underneath it. He had spent his entire adult life kicking down doors on that kind of evil, and over time, he had learned to measure the weight of a catastrophe by the smell of the air and the shape of the silence. But when he crossed the county line, the silence here was different. There were no helicopters overhead, no flashing roadblocks, no soldiers shouting over bullhorns. The highway stretched out under a pale autumn sun, and the only sound was the low rumble of his own engine and the wind pulling at the long yellow grass. He slowed the truck to a crawl. A sedan sat crooked in the opposite lane, doors open, bloodstains trailing from the driver's seat into the weeds. A child's backpack rested on the asphalt, its cartoon characters faded by rain. Leon stepped out. He listened. He heard nothing that he had been trained to hear. No gunfire. No screaming, no coordinated response bleeding across the horizon. Only wind and crows and the slow creak of a farmhouse gate swinging on its hinges far off the road. He drove deeper. Every town he passed told the same story in slightly different handwriting. Burned homes, their beams collapsed inward like broken rib cages. Grocery stores with their windows smashed and their shelves stripped. Churches with hand-painted signs that read "Forgive us," or "Pray for us," or simply "Gone." There were no bodies in the streets, which unsettled him more than bodies would have. Bodies meant a fight. Bodies meant a moment, a last stand, a line someone had tried to hold. Empty streets meant people had simply walked away from their own lives and never come back. Then, as the sun began to lean toward the trees, he saw them. They came out of the forest the way deer might, hesitant at first, then drawn by the sound of him. One, then three, then a dozen, then more than he could count at a glance. Their skin was gray, their mouths slack, their eyes cloudy and uninterested in anything but the warmth of his breathing. Leon raised his pistol on instinct and put the first one down with a single clean shot to the skull. It dropped without a sound, no shriek, no mutation, no sudden burst of speed. Just a body folding into the weeds as if it had been tired for a long, long time. He lowered the weapon a fraction, and for the first time in years, something close to confusion passed over his face. These things were slow. They were clumsy. Individually, any trained civilian with a crowbar could handle one. But behind that first wave, the tree line kept moving. More shapes, more silhouette. Hundreds, maybe thousands, stretched back through the woods like a tide that had forgotten how to stop. He reached for his radio. He cycled through the military channels he had been given. Every one of them hissed back the same dead static. He tried the emergency frequency. Nothing. He tried the civilian bands. Nothing. He stood there on an empty highway, surrounded by an army of the quiet dead, holding a radio that no longer connected to anyone, and he understood in that sinking, weightless moment that there was no headquarters left to call. No extraction coming, no containment to enforce. The country had already fallen, and no one had bothered to tell him, because there was no one left to send the message. Most people, faced with that realization, would have broken. Leon did not. He stood in the middle of that highway for a long moment, watching the slow tide move through the trees, and then he did what he had always done when the world stopped making sense. He began to work. He climbed back into the truck, turned it around, and drove until the fuel ran low. He stripped the vehicle of everything useful, rolled it into a ditch to mask its silhouette, and continued on foot with the sun at his back and a map folded into his jacket pocket. One problem at a time, 1 hour at a time. That was the rhythm that had kept him alive through Raccoon City, through Spain, through every buried lab and every royal kidnapping. He fell into it now the way a musician falls into a familiar song. He moved along the shoulder of the road, never on it. He kept the tree line to his right so that he could dive into cover if he needed to. When he passed abandoned cars, he checked them for keys, for water, for medical kits, for anything that could extend his reach by another day. When a small group of the dead shuffled out of a gas station, he did not run. He counted them. He noted the wind direction, stepped upwind so their slow senses could not track him, and walked around them as calmly as a man crossing a busy street. He did not waste a bullet on what silence could handle. By the second morning, he had found a hunting knife, a hatchet, a hardware store hammer whose handle fit his palm like it had been waiting for him, and 2 boxes of ammunition that matched his sidearm. By the third morning, he had mapped the back roads well enough to know which overpasses were bottlenecks, which rivers were shallow enough to cross, and which farmhouses still had intact roofs. He slept in short intervals, always above ground level, always with 2 exits in mind. He ate cold food out of cans and drank rainwater he had boiled over small, carefully hidden fires. He left no trail that a tracker could read and no smoke that a scavenger could follow. It was on the 4th day that the survivors found him, though in truth he had been watching them for nearly an hour before they knew he existed. There were 6 of them, a man in a torn flannel shirt, 2 women, one of them limping, a teenage boy gripping a baseball bat with shaking hands, a little girl clinging to her mother's leg. They had stumbled into the edge of a small town looking for food, and they had stumbled into a crowd of the dead instead. Leon watched them from a rooftop across the street, measuring the situation the way a chess player measures a board. Then he moved. He went down the fire escape without a sound. He crossed the street in a low crouch, using parked cars as cover. He drew the hunting knife first because the knife did not echo. He took the first walker through the base of the skull before it registered his presence. He took the second one the same way. When the angles no longer favored silence, he switched to the pistol, and his shots came in a steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, each one a clean, almost bored execution. He did not shout. He did not celebrate. He cleared the street the way another man might sweep a porch, and when it was done, he stood in the middle of the carnage, reloaded, and turned to the survivors with nothing in his face but quiet attention. They followed him. Of course they followed him. They had seen a man walk into chaos and walk out of it holding the same posture he had walked in with. To them, he looked impossible, calm under pressure, precise in combat, always moving forward. They did not yet know his name, and they did not yet ask. They simply walked behind him because behind him felt like the only place in the world that still made sense. Leon let them, but he kept glancing at the horizon because he knew something they did not. The dead were predictable. People were not. They traveled for 2 days before they saw the smoke. It rose in a thin gray column from beyond a ridge of pine, the kind of smoke that meant cooking fires rather than burning buildings, and the survivors behind Leon exhaled in a ragged, grateful chorus when they spotted it. Other people. A chance to sleep without taking shifts on the watch. Leon said nothing. He simply adjusted the angle of his approach, keeping to the lower ground, and watched the way the smoke curled. It was too thick. Too many fires. Too many mouths. The settlement sat across an old roadside truck stop, its perimeter walled off with stacked cars and chain link dragged from a nearby scrapyard. Men with rifles stood on the rooftops, their silhouettes too relaxed, too casual, the posture of people who had grown comfortable pointing weapons at anyone who walked up the road. A gate creaked open as the group approached, and a tall man with a sun-reddened face and a shotgun slung across his chest stepped forward to greet them. He smiled the way a fisherman smiles at a full net. "Welcome," he said. "Welcome, welcome. You must be hungry." Leon had met this man 100 times before, in 100 different uniforms. The name changed. The smile did not. He counted the guns on the rooftops. He counted the exits. He noted which of the guards were drunk and which were sober, which were bored and which were eager. He let the tall man talk. The rules of the settlement came spilling out in a practiced speech. Everyone contributes. Everyone shares. Weapons stay at the gate for safety. Families are housed separately from single travelers for order. Food is rationed by the council for fairness. Every word was reasonable. Every word was a cage. The survivors behind Leon began unslinging their packs. The mother reached for her daughter's hand. The teenage boy set down his baseball bat with a kind of trembling relief. Leon stepped forward, not quickly, not aggressively, but in a way that placed his body between the tall man and the little girl. He smiled too. He had learned to smile from men exactly like this one. "We appreciate the offer," he said. "We will camp outside the wall tonight and talk again in the morning." The tall man's smile tightened. He looked at the guards on the rooftops. The guards shifted their weight. Someone worked the bolt on a rifle loud enough to be heard. Another man behind the gate reached for the teenage boy's shoulder and tried to guide him forward, saying something soft about hot food and clean blankets. The mother flinched. The little girl began to cry without making a sound. Leon moved. He did not draw his pistol. He did not need to. He took the nearest guard's wrist, turned it against the joint, and relieved him of his rifle in a single fluid motion that ended with the barrel pressed gently under the tall man's chin. The second guard lunged, and Leon broke his nose with the rifle stock without looking at him. The third guard raised his weapon, and Leon put a bullet through the stock of it from 10 feet away, splintering the wood and sending the man stumbling backward with bleeding hands but a beating heart. In the space of 4 seconds, 3 men had been disarmed, 1 had been humbled, and not a single civilian had been harmed. The truck stop went very quiet. Leon lowered the rifle slightly. He spoke without raising his voice. "These people are with me," he said. "We are leaving. You are going to let us." And then he turned, and he walked his survivors out through the gate, the same way he had walked them in, his back straight, his breathing even, his eyes never once leaving the rooftops. The tall man watched them go. He did not shout. He did not order a volley. He only wiped the thin line of blood from where the rifle had pressed against his throat, and he smiled again, and this time the smile was a promise. He would find them. He would find the man in the jacket. And he would make sure the lesson went the other way next time. They walked for 3 more days before the skyline rose out of the haze. It had once been a mid-sized city, the kind of place with a baseball stadium and a river walk and a handful of glass towers that had tried to look important. Now it stood half swallowed by its own shadow. Ivy climbed the office buildings. Traffic lights still blinked red above intersections where no cars had moved in months. A tattered banner on the side of a bank read "Together we recover," its letters peeling like old skin. Leon stood at the edge of the off-ramp and looked down at it for a long time before he spoke. "We need medicine," he said. "Generators. We go in carefully. We take what we can carry. We do not stay the night." The survivors nodded. By now they had learned that when Leon spoke in that particular cadence, flat, unhurried, final, there was no point arguing. They followed him down into the streets. The city reminded him of Raccoon, and the memory settled into his chest the way old shrapnel settles into old bone. But Raccoon had been a wound made in a single night, a place screaming in its last hour, full of gunfire and sirens and the frantic panic of a government trying to smother a fire with a blanket. This place was different. This place had not screamed. This place had simply sighed over weeks and months until the sighing stopped. Every storefront was a small archaeology of the day it had given up. Handwritten signs in pharmacy windows reading out of antibiotics, sorry. Cardboard shrines at street corners with photographs of the missing, their faces faded by rain into ghostly smudges. A child's bicycle lying on its side in the middle of a crosswalk as if its rider had simply stepped off and walked into the dark. They moved in pairs through the downtown grid. Leon took the teenage boy with him, partly because the boy was the most eager to prove himself, and partly because the boy was the most likely to do something reckless if left alone. The parking garages were the worst. The dead had drifted into them over time and stayed, shuffling in slow circles between the concrete pillars, their moans echoing off the low ceilings until the entire structure sounded like a cathedral full of grieving monks. Leon taught the boy to move from pillar to pillar, to breathe through his nose, to tap the hilt of his knife against metal only when he wanted to draw one of them away from the group. The boy listened. The boy learned. By the 3rd level, he had taken his first kill with a clean downward thrust, and afterward he sat on a curb and shook quietly for 10 minutes while Leon stood watch and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence would not say better. The hospital, when they reached it, had been looted so thoroughly that even the bed frames had been stripped of their screws. But Leon knew hospitals. He knew that panicked looters took the front shelves and ignored the back rooms, that they grabbed painkillers and missed insulin, that they smashed glass cabinets and overlooked locked drawers under desks. He found antibiotics in a supply closet behind a collapsed ceiling tile. He found clean bandages in a laundry cart that had been shoved into an elevator shaft. He found a working blood pressure cuff in a pediatrician's office whose door had been covered by a fallen vending machine. Every small victory was a reminder that the world had not been killed by the dead. It had been killed by the living, by their haste, by their hoarding, by their inability to see past the next hour. The police station confirmed it. He found it near the river, its front steps still lined with dried flowers from some forgotten vigil. Inside, the walls were papered with maps, red string stretched between pushpins, evacuation routes drawn in black marker over the city grid. There were clipboards full of shift rotations that had been abandoned mid-sentence. There was a coffee mug on a desk with mold grown into a perfect ring at the bottom. There were emergency logs that ended, not with a final battle, but with a single line that read no further updates, followed by nothing at all. Leon sat down in the chair behind that desk. He placed his hands flat on the wood. He looked at the map and the string and the unfinished plans of men who had tried, honestly tried, to save their city, and who had run out of time before they had run out of ideas. This world had not lost because the monsters were stronger. It had lost because the systems had collapsed first. And quietly in that empty office, with the boy waiting in the doorway behind him, Leon made a promise he did not speak aloud. If this world could not be cured, it could at least be held together. One street, one settlement, one shift at a time. They had chosen a small farmstead on the outskirts of the city, a compound of 3 wooden buildings ringed by a low stone wall, with open fields on 2 sides and a creek on the third. Leon had picked it himself. Good sightline, limited approaches, a root cellar that could hide the children if the worst came. The survivors had spent a week reinforcing it, cutting brush, sharpening fence posts, hanging tin cans on wire to serve as early warning. For the first time since the world had ended, they had begun to sleep through the night. Which meant, of course, that the world was about to remind them why they should not. The tall man came at sunrise. He brought 16 men with him, pickup trucks with welded plating, a rusted school bus fitted with firing slits along one side. He did not announce himself. He did not negotiate. He simply drove his bus up the dirt road at full speed and opened fire on the farmhouse with everything he had, and his men began howling and shooting into the air as they came, because they knew, as every raider learns eventually, that gunfire does more than frighten the living. It calls the dead. Leon had been awake for an hour already. He had heard the distant engines long before the first shot. By the time the bullets began chewing into the wooden siding, he had the survivors in their assigned positions, the children in the cellar, the 2 best shots on the rooftops, the wounded passing loaded magazines up through the floorboards. He stood in the upstairs window of the main house with a hunting rifle he had stripped and cleaned the night before, and he watched the raiders come across the open field, and he exhaled slowly, and he began his work. The first raider dropped at 200 yards, a clean shot through the shoulder that spun him into the grass screaming, because Leon did not need to kill men to break them, only to remove them from the fight. The second dropped the same way. The third tried to run back to the bus, and Leon let him, because a running raider was a raider spreading panic through his own line. The tall man's voice rose above the chaos, shouting orders, trying to hold his formation together, and for a moment Leon considered taking him first. He did not. He knew what happened to raider crews when their leader was still watching. They stiffened. They became predictable. A predictable enemy was a gift, but the dead were already answering the call. Leon could hear them now, beneath the gunfire, that low collective moan rolling in from the woods like distant surf. He keyed the small radio at his belt. "Horde incoming from the east tree line," he said. "Kill lanes up. Conserve. Count your shots." On the rooftop, the flannel-shirted man and the limping woman shifted their fire. The teenage boy, stationed at the south barricade with a shotgun, whispered the count to himself the way Leon had taught him. "Breathe. Breathe." The raiders reached the stone wall and found it harder than they had expected. The fence posts, sharpened and angled outward, punched into the sides of their trucks and tore open tires. The tin can wires, strung at ankle height through the grass, tripped 2 men into the mud. The bus tried to ram the gate and found the gate braced from behind with a tractor engine block, and the bus crumpled around it like a beer can under a boot. Men spilled out of the wreck, coughing, bleeding, and they looked up into a farmstead that had been waiting for them, and their morale broke in a single visible wave. Then the dead arrived. They came out of the east tree line in a slow, relentless flood, drawn by every shot, every shout, every scream. The raiders, already shaken, now found themselves caught between a fortified farm and an army that did not feel pain. Leon watched the tall man's face as he understood. There was a moment, a single moment, in which the smile that had greeted them at the truck stop gate tried to reappear and failed, and fell away into something much smaller and much more human. Then the tall man ran. His men ran with him. Most of them did not make it past the tree line. Leon did not fire on the fleeing raiders. He turned his rifle instead to the horde, and he began the patient, disciplined work of thinning it. One shot. One shot. The rooftops echoed him. The barricade echoed him. The farmstead became a small, steady drumbeat of aimed fire in a world that had forgotten what aimed fire sounded like. The horde did not break, because the horde could not break. But it thinned, and it passed. And by the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the field around the stone wall was still. And the survivors inside the farmhouse walls were still breathing, and the only sound was the wind in the grass and the slow, relieved weeping of the mother in the cellar as she held her daughter and realized that morning had come, and that they were still in it. They expected him to take the chair. That was the strange part, the part that told Leon more about this world than any map or logbook ever could. In the days after the siege, as the farmstead cleaned its wounds and buried the few it had lost, the survivors began looking at him the way people in older stories had looked at kings. They asked him where to dig the new latrine. They asked him who should stand watch and for how long. They asked him whether the flannel-shirted man or the limping woman should be in charge of the food stores, as if those were decisions only he could make. He understood what was happening. He had seen it before, in smaller ways, in Spain and in the aftermath of Raccoon. When people are frightened long enough, they will hand their freedom to the first person who looks like he knows what he is doing. And the first person who takes it is almost always the wrong one. So he refused. Gently, firmly, and again he refused. Instead, he taught. He taught firearm safety first because he had watched too many good people die from their own weapons. He lined up every adult in the compound, unloaded each rifle and pistol himself, and walked them through the basics as patiently as a school teacher with a new class. Where the safety was, how to clear a chamber, how to carry a weapon so that a stumble did not become a funeral. He made them practice with empty guns until their hands stopped shaking. Only then did he let them load. He taught patrol rotation next. He drew a rough map of the farmstead in the dirt with a stick, and he showed them how to think about sight lines, how to overlap fields of view so that no one was ever watching alone, how to trade off shifts so that no one became too tired to see clearly. He taught them the difference between a patrol that walked a route and a patrol that thought about a route. The first one, he said, will get you killed by a clever enemy. The second one will keep you alive long enough to become a clever enemy yourself. He taught escape route. He made every person in the compound, down to the little girl who had cried silently at the truck stop gate, walk the primary and secondary evacuation paths 3 times each, in daylight and at dusk, until they could follow them with their eyes closed. He taught medical triage, drawing red, yellow, and green on strips of cloth and pinning them to the shirts of volunteers in mock drills. He taught quiet movement, showing the teenage boy how to place the outside edge of his foot down first, how to breathe through an open mouth to cut the sound in half, how to listen to a building before entering it. And as he taught, something began to shift. The mother who had trembled at the gate began organizing the food stores with a quiet competence that surprised even her. The flannel-shirted man, who had once deferred to every voice in the room, began taking charge of the Eastern Watch with a steadiness that made the others trust him. The limping woman turned out to have been a nurse before the world ended. and within 2 weeks she had converted one of the outbuildings into a small clinic with labeled shelves and clean linens and a door that locked from the inside. They were becoming, slowly, unmistakably, a community. Not a flock gathered around a shepherd, but a village of people who had remembered that they had hands. Leon watched them one evening from the rooftop where he had first taken his shooting position during the siege. The sun was going down over the fields. Somewhere inside the farmhouse, someone was laughing and someone else was teaching a child a song. He did not smile. He rarely did. But something in his shoulders eased by a fraction. This world might never be cured. The dead would walk tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after that. But a cure was not the only kind of hope. Sometimes hope was simply a field where people had learned to stand their watch. The radio found him on a Tuesday. Leon had kept it on a low shelf in the main house, tuned to a rotating set of emergency frequencies, more out of habit than belief. For weeks it had given him nothing but static. Then, just before dawn, it gave him a voice. A woman, young, frightened, speaking in short bursts between bouts of coughing. A group of families. A church basement somewhere to the north. Surrounded. Running out of water. "Please," she said. "Please, if anyone can hear this." Leon sat with the radio in his lap for a long time before he reached for his jacket. They gathered at the gate to see him off. All of them. The mother. The teenage boy who was not really a boy anymore. The flannel-shirted man. The limping nurse. The little girl who pressed a folded paper drawing into his hand without speaking. The settlement had grown enough by now that there were faces among the crowd he had never properly learned, and that, more than anything, was the sign that his work here was finished. A place did not need a guardian once it had learned to guard itself. They asked him to stay. Of course they asked. The flannel-shirted man offered him the best room in the main house. The nurse offered to train a successor so he could rest. The teenage boy, his voice cracking somewhere between childhood and the man he was becoming, simply said, "We need you." Leon looked at him for a long moment, and he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and he said, "No. You needed me. You do not anymore. That is the difference." He smiled then, the small, tired smile of a man who had lived too long in hard places to smile any other way. He shouldered his pack. He checked his sidearm. He stepped through the gate, and he did not look back, because he had learned long ago that looking back was a kindness you gave to yourself at the cost of the people watching you go. The sun was rising over the fields as he walked. Somewhere to the north, a woman was whispering into a broken radio, hoping that someone in the world still cared enough to come. Somewhere further than that, other voices were waiting, other basements, other gates, other small stubborn lights that had not yet gone out. There were too many roads left unguarded. Too many people still trapped. One man could not save a world. But one man, moving steadily from one light to the next, could remind a world that saving was still a thing that happened. In the seasons that followed, the survivors at the farmstead told his story to the children who came after. They spoke of him the way older peoples had once spoken of saints and wandering knights. A man who had arrived when everything was lost. A man who had known how to fight the dead, and who had reminded the living how to live.